we need to do what Howard Macmillan did in the 1950s as housing secretary, the most successful housing secretary ever, which is build a lot of social housing.
Bim Afolami, MP for Hitchin and Harpenden. First Tory MP in the JOE office.
No, I can't believe that, actually.
How do you feel about that?
That surprises me. I'm very happy. Surprised, but happy to be
Why
there.
does that surprise you?
Because if you're in politics, you should always be trying to talk to as many people as possible, from old, young, left, right, whatever party you're in, because ultimately everybody has an equal vote, right? So why shouldn't you be engaging with every media organisation, particularly one that's got the reach that you guys have here?
I mean, the sell on that, that's the best sell we could have possibly asked for. You're not sponsored.
No, I'm not paid. I'm not sponsored.
We're here to talk about millennials, aren't we?
We are.
And how you're going to win back the millennial vote.
That's the plan.
Yeah. So it all comes from this concept that as people get older, they become more right-wing, which means they start to vote Tory again. And you don't think that's happening anymore?
Well, there was always this view that, broadly speaking, as people went through life stages as they got older, they got married, they bought a home, they got a more steady job, they started to worry about their community, their pension, etc. And then they retire and then they die. All of those life stages are meant to make people more conservative. And for the sort of the baby boomer generation, that definitely happened. But all the indications are, and we've done some work, I did some work with Onward, the recent report that you mentioned, all the indications are that this isn't happening anymore. And actually, my generation, our generation, millennials, people aged roughly between 25 and 40, they aren't becoming more conservative as they age. And if you're a Conservative MP, or you want the Conservative Party to do well, then that's a problem.
And what is that? Because they've got nothing to conserve? Is that what it is?
I think that's part of it. I basically think it's for three main reasons. The first is exactly what you say. The average age, for example, of first-time buyer in 1997, so the year that we left office in the Blair landslide, was 26. Now it's 35 coming up to 36. So it's gone 10 years in that period of time. So if you are, just to use this as one example, if you are of this age group, you are seeing your chances, if you have no family wealth, which most people don't, you can see your chances of owning a home going down with no real prospect of that changing in the near future. I think that's one reason. The second is the marginal tax rate for graduates is higher than it was in the baby boomer generation. In the baby boomer generation, if you were a graduate, which most people were not, then I think tuition fees were free. Obviously, nowadays, they're not free. So I think that's just your marginal tax rate you're paying. The amount of money you have at the end of every week, at the end of every month, is just not very much. And I think that's a problem. And then the third is something that I feel with my age. So look, I've just turned 37. I feel I just missed, which was the global financial crisis. And why I mean just missed it, when I left university, I was offered a job. I went to become a corporate lawyer in the City of London. I was offered my job before the global financial crisis. And I remember that job market as a graduate. The job market since then, not just as a graduate for city jobs, but across the board, not just in this country, but in America and other countries in the Western world, has been much harder for new people entering the workforce for a whole range of reasons. And if you're coming into the job market after the global financial crisis, I think the world that those young people saw was very different. So I think for those three reasons, you aren't seeing this sort of automatic trend towards conservative. If that was ever the case, it was the case for the boomer generation. If you go back before that, it's a bit more complicated, but it had been the case for much of the 20th century. In the 21st century, we are not seeing that. That's why I think, as a Conservative Party, we need to understand that, be honest about it, address it, and then seek to deal with those concerns.
It's almost like sitting down with what I would hope a Labour MP would say to me in an interview. You've basically pointed out all of the symptoms that I suppose millennials are crying out for, and arguably have been ignored for the past 13 years. I mean, what do you think is the next step then? Do you think that the party needs to pivot entirely, go back to revise all of the issues you just put out, go back to small c conservatism? I mean, how do you progress? How do you reverse what's happened over the last 10 years?
So if you take two issues in particular, one of which I think flows from the other one, which is income, just the amount of money that you have at the end of the week, at the end of the month. If a Conservative Party can't deal with that problem, then we have no business being in politics. One of our core principles since our founding has been economic opportunity, economic progression for the individual and the family. That was what Thatcher's whole ideological stance, her rhetoric, her base was built on.
I've got to be honest with you, that's not going to be a popular name to bring up on this channel.
But the point I'm trying to make to you is, as a Conservative, we have to deal with that. How do you do that? One aspect is obviously growing the economy. And look, we could spend a long time talking about all the things you need to do in order to do that. But I think having that as a focus, growing the economy and creating more opportunities for younger working people is really important. And to make sure that the benefits of that growth do not unfairly accrue too much to perhaps older people who already have assets, right? So it's about the distribution of that wealth. And the second thing is taxes. Because, of course, one way in which we can make sure that people have more of their own money is to reduce their taxes. And I think reducing the marginal taxes for younger people, millennials, as we're talking about today, I think is absolutely critical. Growing the economy, making sure they get the economic opportunities, reducing taxes, that's a key thing. The second, which flows from that, is affordability of housing. Now, there are all sorts, we could spend, I'm sure you have spoken on this program before about housing market, the difficulty of getting on the housing ladder. It's a very complicated and renting.
Renting's big, yeah.
And renting, it's a big subject. I can't pretend that I have all the answers. But what I do know is that there are things the government can do to enable the market to work better. How do we do that? It's by making sure that we increase the supply of housing in a way that directly benefits the people who are most disadvantaged, which are millennials. Because one of the difficulties with how the system works now is that even when we build lots of houses in wherever those houses are across the country, putting aside the difficulty with that and the arguments about that, often those houses are bought by people who already have assets. I think the percentage of people who are the number of retirees who own a second property is over 20%. Right, which if you think about it, is huge.
Yeah.
So how do we use our existing, the new houses that we build, and indeed our existing housing stock, to more benefit the people that really need them, right? Help to Buy was a scheme that the government set up several years ago under David Cameron's leadership. It was closed in 2019. I think we should reopen it and treble it and focus it particularly to make sure that people with that scheme can save a deposit of about £36,000, which will mean that you can cover the median price of a home in the country, which is about £290,000 to £300,000, right? So I think that's one thing we can do. Secondly, the government owns 2.2 million acres in this country. Not all of it will be suitable for building, but a lot will. And on that land, we need to do what Harold Macmillan did in the 1950s as housing secretary, the most successful housing secretary ever, which is build a lot of social housing and private housing on that land, but let's have a real focus on social housing, because when you build lots of social housing, you don't just help the people that can't afford to buy a home but can only afford to rent. You're helping everybody because you're increasing the supply in the market, you're reducing the cost of rents, and by doing that, with a right to buy element as well, as long as, of course, what you need to do with the right to buy element is make sure that you continue building, replenish the stock, you continue to build the housing. But I think doing that has something for everybody. If you're somebody who wants to buy your own home and think you can afford to, you can be in social housing for a period of time, save up, and then buy your home. If you're somebody that is in a low-earning profession but wants a decent place to live, and why shouldn't you, because this is Britain, then you should also have access to a great home that's new and that's built with the right infrastructure on government-owned land. This is the sort of thing the government can do.
But they can't, but I would argue, I'd push back on you slightly and say, you've got a lot of landlords who vote for you, and landlords that have benefited heavily from lack of supply and increased demand. How are you going to appease that wing of the party? Because there are certainly many MPs who are landlords themselves, or who have constituents who are very vocal about how they want to, keep landlordism alive. Yep. How do you appease them?
Landlords, a lot of them, they have children too.
Right.
And they know that their children need somewhere that they can afford to live. A lot of landlords aren't landlords out of some sort of, they don't want to become part of this rentier class that Thomas Piketty attacks in his books and this sort of thing. They're doing it because they couldn't see another safe investment for the meager savings that they had. And they thought that on the basis of recent few decades experience, putting it into a small flat somewhere would at least accrue some wealth for them over time. Most landlords are not rich people in that sense. And actually, what we've been doing over the last 10 years has been making it less tax efficient to be a landlord. You used to get mortgage interest relief on your mortgage repayments as a landlord. That is now, I think, gone, or it's about to be completely finished. And George Osborne started phasing that out. For example, that was a huge benefit to being able to be a landlord before. Why did we put that in? Why did we remove that tax benefit? Because we wanted more supply in the private market. So I just think that one of the things that happens sometimes with parties is we think that the most recent tradition or ideological points is what's been there forever. And I think on things like housing, as a Conservative Party, we need to recognise our own heritage as a party in the 50s and 60s and 70s built lots of social housing. And I think that doing that in the modern world, in a modern way, on government-owned land, building the infrastructure at the same time as building the housing so that we don't get the issues that you see too often in the home counties. Look, I'm a home counties MP, and I know this, new housing development comes, there's no infrastructure with it, and of course people are annoyed by that, and they're right to be. So doing it in the right way, I think, can have a huge benefit and is a core Conservative principle, giving economic opportunity to people who don't have it. That's why we're in business.
Okay, build. I get that. But in the interim period of while you're getting this all approved and signed off, what do you make of rent controls? Particularly, Liverpool, Manchester, London.
The problem with rent controls is that wherever they've appeared, they don't tend to work. Let's take Berlin. Berlin had rent controls, didn't have rent controls. It brought them in. And what ended up happening was the people that own the properties stopped investing in them. They stopped wanting to rent them out. And even when, so a bunch stopped wanting to rent them out and they say, I'm not going to bother. And then a bunch do rent them out, but they allow them to get in a terrible state. And
I would tell you that is what most London properties, I can't speak for Manchester, but my God, the level of black mould in London rented properties, absolutely horrendous. They're just dilapidated. Some landlords don't care. They're already there.
That's true. And we've got to do everything we can. And actually, one thing that Michael Gove is doing is he's spending a huge amount of time putting together a package that is a lot better for renters. And I don't know all the details of it, but it's something I've spoken to him about myself, and he's very, very passionate about that.
The landlords were upset with it, so it must be all right.
Yeah, and you're completely right to focus on that. But if you would end up with more of something that's bad, I don't see why we should do it. So I don't think rent controls are the right way of dealing with it. The right way of dealing with it, as I say, is to have more social housing, which injects much more housing much faster into the market. Because I think often, and then, of course, when it's social housing, you can direct it much more to who you need it to go to. Because, and again, I come back to this core point about economics. And the thing in the report, yes, there were other issues. Yes, younger people care about the NHS. They care about transport. They care about cultural issues. They do care about a range of things. But their focus on just their economic well-being, the opportunity they had, or the perception of a lack of opportunity, that was the core thing. And that was why we sort of had something in the report saying they were shy capitalists, which, isn't meant to be provocative to Joe. But it was our way of trying to describe that they were, when we put to them directly, would you prefer lower taxes or redistribution? They went for lower taxes. And I think that says a little bit about the focus on economic opportunity.
I would challenge you slightly and say, do you think that perhaps that's to do with the new high rate of marginal tax? Is that the problem? Because when I look at what's coming out of my paycheck, it's huge. The amount that's coming out for student loan, the national insurance is so much higher than what my parents used to pay. Do you think that maybe millennials are just saying we can't pay any more, rather than actually just not being, not wanting to redistribute wealth? It's actually just they're already charged an extortionate rate.
Well, obviously, as I mentioned, tax is a key concern, and I think we need to bring those marginal tax rates down. I was very clear about that. And yes, of course, if you're feeling really pressed, then if somebody says low taxes or something else, you'll go for the low tax option. But all that I'm saying is there's been a bit of I think pundits over the last few years, ever since the Brexit vote really, have spent a lot of time saying that economics doesn't matter anymore. The thing that matters in politics is culture, and cultural issues are the things that matter. And I'm not saying they don't matter. All that I'm saying is if you compare bread and butter issues with culture, bread and butter issues win every single time. And I put redistribution in a culture bracket, not because it is cultural, obviously we're talking about economics, but because if you say to a voter, do you care about equality and redistribution? It's almost a cultural type question. It's a framing of how do they feel about the country, how do they feel about their values. The thing that matters most in politics, in democratic politics, and indeed all politics, and I think this is a good thing, is that people look out for themselves, their families, their communities, and who's going to do well. And I think that that's right. And we shouldn't allow ourselves to be distracted by a lot of cultural issues that aren't as important. And that can often, the cultural sort of debate can often be deliberately stoked by elements on both the left and the right.
Mm-hmm. Does it concern you then that many pundits think that the next election will be fought and won on cultural issues?
It does concern me insofar as I think they're going to be wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think that, and I say this to people in my own party, and I say it to people on the left, the people on the left that will spend a huge amount of time effectively importing American-style cultural debates into our own politics. There was arguments about whether the UK was going to abolish rights to abortion, for example. Mm-hmm. That was never, ever on anybody's mind in this country. It never has been. And in Parliament, there's a hefty majority in favour of a woman's right to choose, for example. But there was a time when after the Roe versus Wade debate in the US, people said, in Britain, it's like, no, it's not the case. A lot of the trans debate, again, which, by the way, affects a tiny number of people, I think gets disproportionate attention. But again, a lot of that trans debate is coming from the United States on the left. And on the right, similarly inspired by the United States, is a sort of idea of this sort of evangelical sort of Christian right type politics, which I just do not think in this country has any purchase at all. Neither of these things is where most people are. And it's not, even if certain people will have elements of either, it's not what they care about the most. And I think that as a politician, you've got to be thinking, what is going to benefit my constituents and the country the most over the next year, next 5 years, next 10 years? That's how we should focus.
I think maybe some of that concern, though, was coming from, Rishi Sunak is probably the most evangelical prime minister we've had in quite some time. There's a lot of think tanks as well that are being widely influenced by this American Christian right that you talk about. Maybe it is overblown and maybe it's overhyped by the media, but there's certainly some threads that are coming through.
So you're right, but the point I suppose I'm trying to make is, because of our cultural affinity with the United States, speak the same language, we're even ethnically similar in many ways, whether it be black, white, Indian, we see our cousins in the United States. A lot of political elites, and indeed business elites, and cultural elites in journalism, we just have such an affinity with the United States that we think that for the majority of people, this is how they think about the world. And there's this great writer called Tomiwa Owolade who's just written a book on race and how race and the debate around race in Britain has become increasingly sort of affected by the United States discourse, which is completely different to the British experience. Mm-hmm. And again, he's a black writer, he's just saying, look, Britain, there are all sorts of difficult things in our racial history as a country, but it's not the United States. and it's a completely different thing. And I just use that as another example of how often we're importing a cultural debate that isn't really present in the lives of British people.
I mean, yeah, but perhaps, I mean, the Dame Louise Casey report would probably say that, lives are, people, black and ethnic minorities do suffer at the hands of police in a way that white people simply don't. So, I mean, I guess that's not really an import of ideas. That is something that is actually embedded in our society, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, look, I am struck by when you look at the police, and I'm focusing on the Met Police, which may be unfair, but that's the
what we know most about.
They clearly have had a long-term problem with racism in that force. When someone of the political persuasion of Paul Dacre makes it his campaigning mission in the Daily Mail to talk about racism in the police, you know that there was a real problem. This wasn't somebody doing this for political wins. He wasn't doing this to support the Labour Party. He wasn't doing this to support Jack Straw or Tony Blair. He was doing it because I think he came across the Lawrence family in some capacity, and he heard their story and just thought how wrong it was. And once they started investigating, saw the difficulties. Now, I know that's from the 1990s, I think in 1993, Stephen Lawrence. But if you speak to people who know the Met Police, whether they be black officers or white officers who care about this issue, they will say, yes, lots of things have improved, but there are a lot of problems still. And indeed, with Wayne Couzens, we saw the difficulty in a different way. I know that's not about race, but it was a completely different issue. Not because there wasn't a bad apple. Wayne Couzens was obviously a bad apple, but the way how the bad apple was known and was tolerated in elements of the service. And I think that's, it's an institution that needs reform. That's clear.
Okay, let's go back to housing a little bit, because I think your ideas on it are very interesting. Can I ask you about garden cities? What was your proposal with that?
Well, garden cities, and my constituency is very close to one, Letchworth Garden City, which was, I think, 1912 or there or thereabouts, in the early 20th century, and it was one of our first iterations of it. But what garden cities can be in the modern era, I think, are really three things. The first is we have the most environmentally friendly homes we can find and we can build, so that the costs of running them are really low and are almost a model to the rest of the country and internationally about what you can do with modern building methods. And secondly, you really have an opportunity to design an infrastructure that's right for the 21st century rather than the 20th. Whenever you go round a major city and you see on tight roads where you've got one lane here and one lane there, and then they've shoehorned a sort of cycle lane into one side and shoehorned a cycle lane onto the other side, and nobody's happy because the car users don't have enough space, and the pedestrians don't have enough space, and the cyclists don't have enough space. Now, I'm not criticizing that per se, but these cities weren't designed for what we're now trying to use them for. In a garden city, we can do that, and you can do that with how you design the infrastructure, making sure that community centres, and I don't mean community centres in the sort of classic build a community centre, I mean whether they be a village hall or a town hall, or whether they be pubs or cafes or centres for sort of nursery centres or whatever it is, or sports clubs or whatever it is. Those community centres are put strategically in the right places so that you're building the right sort of communities, a bit like what the Duchy of Cornwall have done down in the Poundbury in Dorset. Now,
Poundbury is extraordinary.
Right. Now, and I'm not saying you can do Poundbury everywhere, because, of course, Poundbury, why it works is because it's right for the area in which it is. If you were doing it in the northwest, it would be different. It would look, the materials would be different, the houses would look different, and the communities would be different. But the way how they've sought to really put thousands of new homes down and do it in a way that builds brilliant communities is something we should be doing all over the country. And I just think that we've got to have that level of ambition. It sort of, makes me sad when you see next to a wonderful market town anywhere in the country, and then you see a bunch of houses put next door. Yes, we built the houses, and as I said, I'm in favour of that, but just not done in a thoughtful way, not done in an environmentally friendly way, not done in a way designed to build communities and families and homes for everybody to live in and to feel part of. We need to raise our ambitions with housing, not just on the number, but on the type. And I think garden cities and being very conscious and deliberative about how we put them down and where we put them, I think is the way to do it.
It's a wonderful concept. I think the concern would be sort of like, I guess it almost seems farcical for me to say, you know, you've been in power for 13 years, the party, why haven't you done it before? That sort of rhetoric. Do you think that you'll be able to convince the party to do a big rewrite, to go for these ideas, to rip up what's been going on for the last 10 years, which has been an effective decimation of what could be a garden city?
Well, so the way how I see our time so far in government is that, first of all, we had a coalition for 5 years, and the focus on that in those 5 years was bringing down the deficit. You'll remember the debates of that time. Then David Cameron won a small majority in 2015, and pretty soon after that, he was campaigning for the European referendum, which he then lost. And then you had Theresa May, who then had a short period of time with no mandate. Then she had an election, which she then lost her majority in. We then spent, and in 2017, 6 years ago, was when I first came into Parliament, we then spent 2 years torturous debates and arguments about one subject, which was Brexit. Boris Johnson comes in, gets that done, wins a majority, and just when we're getting our heads up, COVID comes. And so it has been difficult in the post-Brexit era to do a lot of the things that we'd like to do. And I'm not saying that everybody will agree with what I'm saying, but I know a lot do. And so I think we have an opportunity with Rishi to say, look, I'm a new leader. He's clearly very different to what has come before. Let's look at things anew. And this is our opportunity. We've got a year or so to do that.
The proposal being then to create a new asset class. Who will vote for you?
Well, the reason to do it is because if you do the right thing, the votes look after themselves. You know, you can't, in politics, the most successful politicians at any level in any country are the people that will do the right thing over the medium long term. Yes, by being tactically astute and not annoying too many people all the time. You've got to pick battles and you've got to be strategic. But if you do the right thing over time, you will get the votes. And I think that that is ultimately the feedback loop of democratic politics. And that's why democracies are, broadly speaking, more successful than any other form of government.
It's going to be hard work for you, though. We were just at, sorry, we were just at Best for Britain, who've done their new MRP poll. Now, a lot of what was coming up in focus groups, there was big concerns about the stewardship that the Conservatives have shown over the economy and how people aren't sure, particularly in Surrey, which is a pretty safe place normally for you guys. They're not sure that you can handle the economy. These ideas seem really interesting. They could really bring voters back. But how will you bring back trust and the promise? You know, how can people believe that you're going to deliver all of this?
Yeah, I think that trust is a key thing, right? Because politicians can say whatever. Ultimately, people have to think that not only do you want to do it, but you've got the capacity to do it. How do we do that? I'd say, first of all, the Prime Minister being so clearly a very different sort of person from his predecessor needs to be front and centre of that and needs to own the change. And then the second thing is we just have to get some of the basics right. And that's why, though it can sound corny and political, the Prime Minister's 5 priorities, you know, the NHS, you know, cut waiting lists, grow the economy, reduce debt, etc. It's really important that you can show that you can deliver on basics. It's like if you're, you know, if you're in a new relationship with somebody, if somebody's like, oh, I'm going to take you to Paris, okay, fine. But if they won't turn up for a drink in the local pub and they stand you up, well, that's probably not boding very well for the longer term, right? So
it's an interesting analogy.
We've got to make sure that we are doing the basics and improving on the basics. And over time, I think the public will start to trust us if we can, and once we present to them the future vision, whether it be for millennials and housing like I've been talking about, whether it be the economy more generally, whether it be on areas like the NHS, whatever it is, we've got to be able to show there's a better future. But I know that we're not going to be able to do that unless we can deliver on the basics.
Boris Johnson's gone. Do you think that's the end? The end of Boris Johnson? Rishi Sunak is now the new Conservative?
Not the end of... I'm sure he'll continue to be a sort of amusing media personality. He'll probably be on here soon.
Bim, with all due respect, I don't quite think that will happen, but we have loved having you here.
Oh, well, it's exactly... Me and Boris are the same thing. No, I do think it's the end for him as a Conservative Party politician, because I think that the Conservative Party wants to move forward. You know, when the day that Boris resigned, I was speaking, I happened to speak at 2 separate Conservative associations that day, and I was expecting lots of people to say, oh, you know, what a shame it is that he's gone, etc. And people just said, you know what, some people said I liked him, some people said I didn't like him, but they all just said, look, we've just got to move forward, we've got to look forward. Let's just move past that, and let's focus on new leader, new team, new party, and deliver for the people.
Palpable fury, though, with some factions.
What, with Boris?
Yeah, I think particularly with the COVID bereaved group. We just had a few in this morning. There is some palpable fury with them about what went down. So it'll be a hard job for you, but a possible job to convince those people.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think on COVID, and this is less about, to be honest, it's less about Boris himself, because obviously, yes, he was the Prime Minister, but there's a whole British state that was trying to deal with COVID. I actually think people need to be a little bit fairer on the broader British state. I think that they were faced with something completely unprecedented, at least in our life and living memory. And they made some mistakes initially, but so did every country. You look at any country's record, every country made mistakes. And they did get to a much better position, and we did get out of lockdown faster than most places, and we got the vaccine faster than anywhere else. That didn't all happen by accident. But what it also showed, if we're very honest, are some of the weaknesses in our state structures, weaknesses in our public health system, weaknesses in how effectively we could get things done, weaknesses in how the union worked, where you had Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland all doing different things and that not linking up with England. And there were weaknesses in the British state. I think that we need to tackle those, and I think that they were laid bare. Weaknesses in our industrial policy, the fact that we couldn't produce the PPE that we needed in our own country, and we had to rely on China, at least in the early days and the first few months, to produce a lot of the PPE. That is a huge weakness economically. So there are weaknesses in our system, and I don't want to sugarcoat those, but I do think that on that at least, Boris, did do a reasonable job, and the British state did get the country through what was a very, very difficult time. And I think people forget when some people say, oh, we spent too much money over COVID. I think we spent something in the region of 400 to 450 billion pounds. I mean, it was a huge amount of money. And yeah, I myself at times thought, gosh, maybe we shouldn't be spending money on this, or we shouldn't be spending money on that. But I don't remember the public at the time saying that. I remember the public at the time saying they wanted more support, they wanted more help, they wanted more money spent in lots of different ways. I'm not saying the public was wrong to do that. But again, after the event, it's easy for some people to say, oh, well, the reason why we've now got, to pay some of this money back and the economy is a bit sluggish and taxes are a bit high is because of this huge £450 billion bill. Well, it was a national emergency of the greatest order that for at least a few months we didn't know could be solved by a vaccine at all. So it was a really, really difficult problem, and I think that ultimately we handled it reasonably well.
Well, I think we'll leave it there. I've really enjoyed speaking to you, Ben.
Oh, you too.
So
really enjoyed it.
Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.